The sea was calm that night, too calm for a war zone. Only the whisper of the Pacific wind and the low hum of engines broke the silence. Out there in the vast dark stretch between islands, a 50-foot wooden torpedo boat cut through the black water like a blade. Inside it, 7 men waited in silence, every heartbeat echoing louder than the ocean itself. They were young, most of them barely in their 20s, but tonight they carried a mission that many had already called madness. The brass had labeled it a suicide run, a mission not meant to return. Even their commander had tried to cancel it, but one man refused to turn away. Lieutenant Mark Reynolds stood at the wheel, jaw clenched, eyes locked on the dark horizon. His uniform was soaked with sea spray, his hands trembling not from fear, but from the cold rush of adrenaline. He'd been told the odds: 8 Japanese ships, heavily armed, moving in formation through the narrow strait. Their task: intercept, delay, and, if possible, destroy them. But everyone knew that a 50-foot wooden boat had no chance against steel monsters hundreds of feet long. Still, Reynolds had said only one thing before leaving the base: "We might be small, but we still bite." The boat, PT-327, was built for speed, not survival. Its 3 roaring Packard engines could push it over 40 knots, but its armor was no thicker than plywood. One shell, one spark, and the whole thing could turn into a floating torch. Inside, the crew whispered to one another, trying to steady their nerves. The mechanic checked the fuel lines again and again. The torpedo operator wiped sweat from his face, though the night was cool, and the gunner stared at the twin .5 caliber machine guns as if they were his only friends left in the world. At 23:47, the radio crackled to life. Command's voice came through the static. PT-327, enemy convoy confirmed, 8 ships approaching from north. Stand by for orders. Reynolds lifted the receiver but hesitated. He already knew what the next words would be: abort the mission, the risk is too high. But something inside him refused to listen. The Japanese had been landing troops on nearby islands for weeks. If this convoy made it through, thousands of Allied soldiers could die. Reynolds switched the radio off without a word. The others looked at him silently. He nodded once, and that was all the order they needed. Engines roared to full power. The little boat surged forward, leaving a long white scar on the surface of the sea. The sound was deafening, a low thunder rolling across the waves. They moved like ghosts, unseen beneath the cover of moonless sky. Minutes passed like hours, until the first faint glow appeared on the horizon. The Japanese convoy, dark silhouettes moving in perfect rhythm, unaware of the wooden shadow racing towards them. Reynolds whispered, "All right, boys, let's wake them up." The gunner's finger rested on the trigger. The torpedo operator aligned the tubes. The mechanic prayed quietly under his breath. Then, without warning, a searchlight sliced through the darkness, sweeping across the sea. Another followed. Within seconds, the night exploded into light. The PT boat had been spotted. Tracer fire streaked through the air, hissing past their heads. The ocean erupted in tall white columns as shells crashed around them. The crew ducked, shouted, scrambled to return fire. Reynolds gritted his teeth, gripping the wheel tighter. "Hold steady, keep moving." The engine screamed as he zigzagged through the deadly rain. Splinters flew from the deck, bullets tore through the thin walls, but somehow the boat kept moving forward. "Range, 900 yards, the torpedo man shouted. Reynolds gave the signal. 2 torpedoes splashed into the dark sea, their engines leaving thin trails of bubbles. 10 seconds later, the night turned into daylight. A massive explosion tore through the first Japanese transport ship. The shockwave hit them like a hammer, throwing one sailor off his feet. The enemy convoy broke formation, alarms echoing across the water. They had done it, a hit. But there was no time to celebrate. A destroyer turned towards them, its guns blazing. Shells tore open the sea around them. One struck near the stern, splintering the hull and spraying burning fuel across the deck. Flames whirred instantly. The mechanic grabbed a bucket, throwing seawater again and again, coughing through smoke. The air filled with the smell of burning gasoline. Reynolds shouted, "We're not done yet. Load the next ones." The torpedo tubes hissed again. Another pair of silver fish darted into the dark. Moments later, a second explosion followed. Then a third. Another ship listed sharply to one side, its bow sinking fast. The Japanese gunners screamed orders, but confusion spread like wildfire. In the chaos, two of their own ships collided, creating a ball of fire that lit the entire strait. The little PT boat darted through the inferno like a shadow. Every man on board knew they couldn't last much longer. The hull was cracked, the engines bleeding fuel, and the flames were creeping back towards the ammunition storage. But Reynolds refused to stop. He steered straight towards the heart of the enemy formation. "If we're going down, we're taking them with us," he shouted. Machine guns thundered from both sides. The sound was deafening. The ocean glowed with tracer fire, explosions reflecting off the waves like lightning. Reynolds' vision blurred from smoke and salt. The mechanic screamed that the engines were overheating. The radio man was bleeding from a head wound. The torpedo man had one shot left. "Fire it!" Reynolds yelled. The last torpedo launched, cutting through the chaos, vanishing under the waves. Seconds later, a flash so bright it blinded them erupted ahead. The largest Japanese transport ship split open, its deck engulfed in flame. The explosion triggered a chain reaction. Ammunition cooked off. Secondary blasts rippled through nearby ships. One after another, they caught fire, sinking fast into the dark sea. But the price was heavy. The PT boat was burning from bow to stern. Flames reached the fuel tanks, and the men knew they had only moments left. "Abandon ship!" someone screamed. They leapt into the black water, the heat searing their backs. Seconds later, the boat erupted behind them, a column of fire rising into the night. The shock wave rolled over the survivors, dragging them under, before spitting them back to the surface. Silence followed. Only the crackle of burning oil and the distant rumble of collapsing ships broke the stillness. 8 Japanese vessels, transports, escorts, and destroyers were either sinking or already gone. The sea, once calm, now glowed red. Floating debris drifted past like ghosts. Reynolds coughed, clinging to a wooden plank. Around him, 2 of his men surfaced, calling weakly for help. They had no radio, no flares, nothing but the open ocean. Hours passed. Dawn crept over the horizon, painting the smoke-filled sky in shades of gold and gray. The waves carried them slowly towards a small island. Exhausted and half-burned, they crawled onto the shore. When Allied rescue planes finally found them 2 days later, they were barely conscious. The medics couldn't believe what they heard, that a 50-foot wooden boat had sunk 8 enemy ships in less than 15 minutes. At first, the story was dismissed as impossible, but wreckage found later confirmed every word.
The sun rose slowly over the Pacific, painting the horizon in gold and blood. The smoke from burning ships still drifted across the sea, heavy and gray. The survivors of PT-327 lay half-conscious on the edge of a nameless island. The waves lapped against the shore, gentle and cruel at once. For Lieutenant Mark Reynolds, everything was silent. He could hear nothing but his own heartbeat and the faint crackle of flames miles away. His eyes burned from salt and smoke. His uniform was torn, his hands covered in oil. Around him, 2 of his men still breathed. The rest were gone, swallowed by the black water hours ago. He crawled forward, every muscle screaming. The sand beneath him felt strange, unreal. He looked up and saw the sun rising over the wreck-strewn sea. The horizon shimmered with the outlines of distant burning ships, 8 of them, all that remained of a once mighty convoy. The mission was over. The impossible had been done. But now came the hardest part: surviving. The island was small, no bigger than a few football fields, covered in palms and thick vines. They found a small stream of fresh water running through the rocks. Reynolds tore a piece of his uniform, soaked it, and pressed it against the mechanic's burn wounds. The man groaned, but lived. Hours passed like days. Seagulls circled overhead. The heat grew unbearable. There was no food, no radio, no flare gun. Reynolds stared out at the endless sea, wondering if anyone knew what they had done. That evening, as the sky turned purple, the mechanic stirred and whispered, "Did we really do it, sir?" Reynolds didn't answer right away. He just looked out toward the sinking glow on the horizon. Finally, he said quietly, "We did, and nobody's gonna believe it." They spent 2 nights on the island, surviving on coconuts and rainwater. On the 3rd morning, a faint sound reached them, the distant hum of an engine. At first, Reynolds thought it was a dream, but soon the sound grew louder. A patrol plane appeared low over the water, its silver wings flashing in the sunlight. Reynolds jumped up, waving his torn jacket wildly. The plane circled once, then dipped its wings in acknowledgement. Hours later, an American rescue boat appeared. The men were pulled aboard, half dead but alive. As soon as they were given water and bandaged, a young officer approached them. "Lieutenant Reynolds?" he asked. Reynolds nodded weakly. "Sir, command's been looking for you. They thought PT-327 was lost." Reynolds smiled faintly. "It was, but it took a few friends with it." When they returned to base, the news had already spread. The story sounded impossible. A 50-foot wooden boat had destroyed 8 Japanese ships in less than 15 minutes before being blown apart. Most officers dismissed it as a rumor, but when reconnaissance confirmed the wrecks, disbelief turned to silence. For the first time, the Navy realized what had truly happened in that narrow strait. Reynolds and his surviving crew were debriefed for hours. High-ranking officials questioned every detail: the torpedo launches, the explosions, the flames. "You ignored a direct order to abort," one commander said sternly. Reynolds nodded. "Yes, sir." "Why?" came the next question. He paused, then answered simply, "Because someone had to stop them." There was a long silence after that. No one had a reply. Days later, they were told the mission was classified. No press, no recognition. Not yet. The Navy feared the Japanese might exploit the story for propaganda or learn too much about torpedo tactics. The official report called it an engagement with moderate results. Nothing about the chaos, the bravery, or the inferno that swallowed 8 enemy ships. But the sailors who had seen it knew the truth. Word spread quietly through the bases of the Pacific. Men whispered about the 50-foot boat that refused to die. They called it the ghost of the strait. Reynolds spent 2 weeks recovering in a field hospital on Tulagi Island. His burns slowly healed, but his mind never found rest. Every night he saw flashes, the fire, the screams, the sea swallowing his men. One evening, a nurse found him sitting outside, staring at the ocean. "You should sleep," she said softly. Reynolds shook his head. "If I close my eyes, I'm back there." When he was finally declared fit for duty, the Navy offered him a desk job in Australia. He refused. "The sea's still out there," he said, "and so is the enemy." Against his doctor's advice, he returned to command another PT boat, but he was never the same again. The crew noticed he spoke less, smiled rarely, and spent hours checking the engines himself before every mission. Some called him reckless, others called him cursed. Months passed. The war dragged on. New battles erupted across the Pacific. Leyte Gulf, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. In every port, sailors still told the same story, about a lieutenant who disobeyed orders and changed the course of a night with nothing but courage and torpedoes. Nobody knew his name for sure, but everyone knew the tale. When the war finally ended in 1945, Reynolds returned home. The parades, the flags, the victory speeches, all of it felt distant. He stood among the cheering crowds but felt none of it. At night, he dreamed of the burning sea and the faces of the men he couldn't save. One day, he received a sealed envelope from the Navy Department. Inside was a brief note and a medal, the Navy Cross. The note read simply, "For extraordinary heroism under fire." There was no mention of PT-327, no record in the newspapers. The mission remained classified. Years passed, Reynolds moved to a small coastal town in Oregon. He bought a fishing boat and spent his days alone at sea, chasing the quiet that war had stolen from him. Sometimes, local fishermen would see him staring at the horizon for hours, as if waiting for something, or someone. He never spoke much about the war. When asked, he would smile faintly and say, "Just a job we had to do." It wasn't until the late 1960s that the truth began to surface. Declassified Navy documents revealed the long-suppressed story of PT-327. Historians were stunned by the details. The impossible odds, the confirmed wrecks, and the fact that a small wooden boat had crippled a convoy meant to resupply Japanese forces in the Solomon Islands. It had saved thousands of Allied lives. When reporters tracked Reynolds down for an interview, he was already an old man. His hair was white, his hands still steady. Sitting on the deck of his fishing boat, he listened quietly as they read the report out loud. When they finished, he smiled. So they finally wrote it down. The journalist asked if he ever regretted not turning back that night. Reynolds looked out at the waves and replied softly, "No, I'd do it again. The sea takes what it wants, but that night, it gave something back." He passed away a few years later, peacefully, with the sound of the ocean outside his window. The Navy finally made his story public, and PT-327's name was etched into the records of valor. Veterans who had once doubted the legend now knew it had been real all along. Today, deep beneath the Pacific waves, the wreck of that 50-foot boat still rests in silence. Coral has grown over the broken hull, and fish swim through the twisted metal remains. But if you listen closely, sailors say you can still hear the faint echo of engines roaring through the deep, like the heartbeat of a ghost that refused to fade. And though history almost forgot them, the men of PT-327 live on in that echo. The men who faced the impossible, disobeyed fear, and in one furious night of fire and steel, proved that even the smallest ship can leave the biggest mark on the sea.
The ocean has a strange way of keeping memories. It swallows everything, ships, soldiers, even stories. But somehow, it never forgets. Decades after the Pacific War ended, divers exploring the Solomon Islands stumbled upon a piece of rusted metal jutting from the coral. It was barely recognizable at first, covered in layers of sea life. But when they brushed away the silt, they saw the faint outline of a number, 327. The discovery spread quietly among naval historians. Many had read the declassified report, but few believed the wreck would ever be found. Now, lying 50 feet beneath the waves, it was real. PT-327 had returned from legend to history. The divers filmed everything. The hull was broken in two, the torpedo tubes still half intact. Inside, the twisted remains of the control panel lay frozen in time. A brass compass, still pointing north, a broken steering lever, and near the shattered bow, something small glinted in the light, a rusted dog tag, its letters barely visible, M. Reynolds. The world finally knew where the ghosts had slept all these years. When news reached Oregon, the town where Reynolds had spent his last days, people gathered by the harbor. Old fishermen who had known him stood in silence as the local paper ran the headline, "Lost Hero's Ship Found After 40 Years." The Navy sent divers to recover the remains of the wreck and a small plaque to honor the men who had sailed her. It was placed inside a glass case at the Naval Museum in Pearl Harbor. The inscription read, PT-327, a 50-foot wooden vessel that defied fear and changed the tide. Visitors stopped to stare at the little piece of wreckage, many unaware of what it truly meant. Some saw only a relic, but others felt something deeper, the weight of courage that comes from knowing you're not coming back and still going anyway. Among the visitors one day was a gray-haired man holding a folded letter. His name was Daniel Harris, the son of one of Reynolds' crewmates who never returned from that mission. For years, he had grown up hearing whispers about his father's final hours. That day, standing before the glass, he finally read the letter Reynolds had written to his family before the mission. It had been delivered only after the war. The letter was short, almost too simple for the moment it carried. If this reaches you, it means we didn't make it back. But don't let them say we were unlucky. We knew what we were walking into. We did it for the boys who'd never see home again. Tell my mother I don't regret it. The sea is cold, but it's honest. Daniel folded the letter back, eyes wet, and whispered, "You kept your promise, Dad." Outside the museum, the ocean shimmered like glass. Seagulls cried over the harbor, the same sound that once echoed over burning ships. History had come full circle, and for the first time in decades, the sea felt at peace. Far away, across the Pacific, waves still roll over the resting place of PT-327. The coral glows faintly in the moonlight, wrapping around the broken deck like a shroud. No more fire, no more thunder, only the slow heartbeat of the deep. Divers say when they descend into that silence, they sometimes hear a faint mechanical hum, like old engines starting after years of rest. Maybe it's just the current, maybe not. Every generation has stories that remind us what courage really means. Not the kind shouted from podiums or written in medals, but the quiet kind. The kind that makes a man sail into certain death for something greater than himself. Reynolds and his crew never sought fame, never asked for glory. They just did their duty and vanished into the sea. Yet their story refuses to sink. It rises again every time someone whispers their name, every time the sound of an engine echoes across a calm Pacific night. A few years ago, a modern naval officer visiting the site of the wreck recorded a message before diving down. He said, "To the men of PT-327, we still hear you. The ocean remembers." And somewhere below, in that blue silence, it almost felt like the sea answered. As decades turned to generations, the story of the 50-foot suicide run became a legend told not just in naval schools, but across the world. A reminder that size never defines strength, and orders mean nothing when courage takes the wheel. Teachers spoke of it, filmmakers tried to capture it, and sailors saluted whenever they crossed the strait where it happened. Back in Oregon, on the anniversary of the battle, townsfolk still light lanterns by the harbor. They let them drift into the dark waves, each one carrying a flame like the memory of a soul that never came home. Sometimes when the wind is right, the sea glows with 100 tiny lights moving slowly toward the horizon. People say it looks like the little boat still charging forward, refusing to stop. Somewhere out there in that infinite ocean, courage still lives. Not in ships or medals, but in the spirit of men who dared to defy the impossible. Their wooden craft may be gone, but their legacy cuts deeper than steel. They showed the world that bravery isn't measured by survival. It's measured by choice. The choice to keep going when everyone else says to stop. And so the sea keeps whispering their story of a small crew, a wooden boat, and a night that changed everything. The world moves on, but legends like this never fade. They remain etched in the waves, echoing through time, carried by every gust of wind that brushes across the Pacific. Because courage, like the sea, never truly dies. It only goes quiet until someone listens again. If you felt this story, if the bravery of these men touched your heart, then don't forget to subscribe to this channel, stay with us, and join our journey through the forgotten pages of history, where every wave still carries a story worth remembering.